All, a very warm welcome to the latest in our series of webinars relating to the Digest publication. Josh, you can go to the next slide, please. So I'm Hamish Cormack, the head of the Emergency Planning College, and it's brilliant to see so many people joining us. I'd love to sort of add my own comments around lessons, but I'm going to hold on that and actually leave the space for our amazing set of speakers and experts who are going to be speaking later throughout this webinar. And a huge thank you to all the speakers for agreeing to give up time and join us. I want to particularly introduce my friend and colleague, David Russell-Parsons, who some of you may know, but David's from the Resilience Directorate of the Cabinet Office. So it's fantastic that David's agreed to be our keynote speaker, and we'll hear from him very shortly. Just before that, one last thank you, and that's actually to one of the home team, my head of thought leadership, Leanna Ross. She really puts in so much of the horsepower, the brain power behind both Digest and this event. So I want to publicly embarrass her by thanking her here in front of you all. And I'll now hand over to Leanna just for some of the housekeeping.
Thank you, Hamish. That's really helpful. Next slide, please, Josh, if that's okay. And good afternoon to you all. Thank you so much for joining us. On to the next slide, we'll do a whistle-stop tour through the housekeeping. As the next slide comes up, you'll see we've got a full packed agenda in this special extended version of the UK Resilience Lessons Digest webinar, Learning to Manage Lessons. Just to note, the session is being recorded so that it can be published on the website later on for others to catch up on. Please do make use of the chat function for discussion, networking, and also for questions. We're going to pop those in the chat this time rather than the Q&A box, as we know it can be easier to do so, and we can try and catch them all in one place there, which will be great. And at several points during the session, some short polls will appear, and you are more than welcome, and we would love you to take part in them as you see fit. So with further ado, and on to the next slide, please, Josh. I just wanted to very briefly speak about the digest itself. We do this at the start of every webinar. If this is your first, a special welcome to you. For others, this will be familiar. But I just wanted to underscore the purpose of the Resilience Digest, that it is actually anchored into commitments within the resilience framework, and also directly comes from learning itself in terms of some of the lessons that came out of COVID, and also in terms of work from the House of Lords. So we're now on the 5th edition, and it operates always with 3 core objectives: to summarise transferable lessons and themes from exercises and emergencies from a range of relevant sources, to share those lessons, of course, across responder organisations and resilience partners, and coordinate wider knowledge to help drive continual improvements in doctrine, standards, good practice, training and exercising. Finally, on the right here, you'll see 3 icons. The first, light bulb side light, the second, the cogs make it active, and the third, a bookmark there to signal resources. And wherever in the digest you see one of those icons, there will be something additional that you might want to dig into, look at, or implement in your own setting. And I believe that is all the housekeeping I need do. And I think it's now time for me to hand over to David. David, welcome to the webinar. Thank you so much for joining us from Cabinet Office Resilience Directorate, and I will hand over to you so that you can share what you've prepared for today.
Thank you, Leanna, and I would echo what Hamish says about the numbers. It's really, it's a privilege to come on and be invited to share, and lovely to see so many familiar faces on the call, as well as the names. And Hamish and I are sitting in the middle of the Cabinet Office today, sunshine, when appreciated other parts of the country are still suffering from the impacts of that hideous weather event over the weekend. What I would love to do, please, having enjoyed every single webinar to date of the Lessons Digest, because we remember really well from the Cabinet Office when this was made as a commitment in the resilience framework back sort of 3 years ago now, to produce a sort of regular digest series, just to sort of pay so much respect to the work that's been done under that banner. And the fact that we're on Lessons Digest 5 is extraordinary. So again, Leanna, would want to sort of pay particular respect to you. I would like to do really sort of 4 sides in terms of just this overview and introduction. Firstly, it's to sort of talk more about the context for the policy work that's going on in government, and sort of talk through some of the sort of wider resilience systems that we're needing to look at. I'll then come on to our particular directorate, as we in this directorate all work for the government title of UK, or Head of UK Resilience, to tell you about some of the policy areas now underway in that directorate. And then, if I may, slightly more on the home team front, look at 2 of our really exciting policy areas, from the UK Resilience Academy to the National Excising Programme and the Excising Hub, all of which is very much reliant on sort of wider stakeholders and other people on this call. So in terms of the context, I wouldn't want to expand much more on this, but here we are with the government very much under scrutiny for the COVID inquiry response, which the government made a response to sort of 2 weeks ago now, looking at wider instability across, and looking really at all those threats which need us really to press hard on building the national resilience systems that we need for the future, with that sort of wider whole of society approach. So in terms of that context, here we are, all of us on this call from the Resilience Directorate. If we look at the next slide, and appreciate a number of people may have seen this before, but if there are 2 basic functions in the Cabinet Office that deal with both near-term and longer-term resilience, ourselves and our sister unit, the Cobra unit, are very much those 2 sides of the coin. So here, from our perspective, the Resilience Directorate formed over 2 years ago now, to look at all those mid to longer term resilience issues in terms of risk processes and resilience frameworks. If Cobra unit are singly focused on the near term, we'd suggest the sort of 6-month preparedness outlook with the sort of near term risk picture. If I was to sort of give an example or 2 on some of the sort of policy areas for the directorate, our directorate itself, it would be highlighting, please, the National Risk Register, which was published 2 Wednesdays ago now in terms of its refreshed format. That is extraordinary work in terms of how much rigor has gone in to the methodology and the way of presenting the 63 and subcategory risks that are in that register. And I think you might have seen the sort of ministerial announcements about this being the most transparent risk register that we have seen to date, certainly putting the information out there as to where it's needed. And that risk register goes together with another directorate policy area, which is the Prepare website. So again, a website which puts risk information, preparedness information out there in the public domain. There are other areas of policy which are very much being championed and led through the Cabinet Office and sort of wider government governance through that, to make sure we can implement enduring sustainable resilience policy. I'm sure there may be questions on the exact split between the Resilience Directorate and the Cobra unit, but suffice to say the Cobra unit are in pretty constant series of live responses, whether it be the enduring weather events, animal health and human health issues that are very much there as a current feature. If I can move on to two additional policy elements, this is very close to home. It is exciting that we have agreed a commercial model for the Academy. So thrilled to be there, taking our relationship with Serco and the Emergency Planning College to grow the Academy from the Emergency Planning College with the three broad strategic aims there in terms of bringing firstly other providers of resilience training, of resilience policy into a more collaborative framework, building on the good offer from the college at the moment, improving some of the skills and learning under that sort of portfolio and really building on it, and then really strengthening the profession of resilience. I think hopefully captures the three broad headlines of that policy area itself. Supplemented on my last slide, please, which is very much to flag the exercising element. I think we've gone back one. So just to look at the exercising element under the Academy, hopefully people will have seen the sort of joint ownership of some recent guidance that has been published on gov.uk in terms of not only exercising best practice guidance, but the lessons management guidance that then really underpins some of the sort of wider exercising policy maneuvers. We have reinvigorated the national exercising programme. There will be substantial government exercises planned for the next 5 years, looking at that sort of mid to longer term framework. And we're thrilled with the Academy to be developing that exercising hub concept, which you can see flagged as a mission there. I think just to summarise, thrilled to be at this webinar, saluting the number of contributions and where they have come from in terms of the lessons learned. It is extraordinarily satisfying to see lots of resilience professionals bringing some of the lessons that they would want to put back into the system and seeing how some of the lessons processes that the digest does sort of pull through in terms of the sort of feedback. I would hope with this just initial bit to underline the importance of this lessons sort of work in terms of its context with the wider work we're doing. And this is where I'll look at my notes really carefully, because people on this call may have seen the commitments we've made to the COVID-19 sort of inquiry module, which is really important both in terms of recommendations 6 and 7, which address some of the lessons and exercising vulnerabilities that Lady Hallett sort of pointed out in the inquiry itself. With the government response absolutely accepting the recommendations that she made in the COVID-1 module, in terms of there being more to do to strengthen the systematic management of lessons from exercising. The government accepts this will require a central UK-wide online repository of information relating to civil emergency exercises, embedding guidance on making those effective recommendations in exercise reports, and a system that continues to promote learning culture across teams, departments and organisations and multi-agency partners. It is very much there as a commitment, and we want to underline that as we approach this webinar, because this work that we're doing very much belongs to that acceptance of the COVID-19 and wider inquiry work. Then, subject to any immediate questions, which we would hope to answer in the chat, thank you for asking me to be here with you today, and I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much, David. That was much appreciated. And please do put any questions in the chat, as you rightly say. We will be having a question and answer panel at the end of the session. In the past, if you've been online, you'll know that has been squeezed, but hence our extension up to the 90 minutes to enable us to do that. So rest assured, questions will be scooped up from the comments should they not be responded to directly for later on. Thank you once again, David. Looking into the lessons management best practice guidance, we thought it pertinent and on the basis of Digest 5 learning to manage lessons following on from the publication of the guidance back in September, to look at what we've learned about learning lessons. And I think it's helpful at this point just to give a very brief overview of what is in the guidance. It is brief and it is available to download on gov.uk. There might be a link coming into the chat to do that if you haven't already. But I just wanted to canter through some of the key principles that then fed into the learning analysis within Digest 5. So by way of introduction, we find in the guidance helpfully a glossary of some of the terms, and that lessons management in this context we're referring to as a strategic, organised approach to and oversight of planned processes and procedures to achieve evidenced learning from experience in a continual, consistent manner. And part of the challenge that we have, and many of us will be more than aware of, is that actually some of our terminology is quite difficult in this area in order to garner the support for the action that we need sometimes. And so in the guidance, there's been a distinction made between a lesson, as in one that anyone might learn in their day-to-day lives, but through their experiences, towards a lesson identified being that step further as an evidence-based conclusion of analysis of observations and insights that describes a problem, details, hopefully, a root cause, and sets out a course of action to achieve positive improvements in response. Of course, sometimes lessons also refer to notable practices, which would be a positive or innovative action that actually doesn't just work well, but it's observed to achieve better than anticipated outcomes. So we're moving from experience as a broader learning experience through to more evidence-based learning from those exercises and, of course, from the emergencies that happen. And then when we're looking towards what we might traditionally refer to as a lesson learned, we're starting to rephrase slightly in terms of considering that a lesson that's been implemented. Of course, the lesson itself being a summary of the problem, we know that we're implementing hopefully the positive change in response to it. But nonetheless, it can help us move away from an assumption that the learning is done intuitively or instinctively towards a mindset where something, an action, has to be implemented and evaluated, hopefully, as to whether it was successful in resolving the original issue. And then also segmenting out, finally, that embedded learning and change as something that is a bit separate from the initial implementation. And in scoping the guidances, we noted that actually everybody has an intuitive sense of what embedded learning and embedding change is. And yet when we try to operationalize what that looks like in practice, it can be a real challenge. And that, of course, is still something that other researchers, and one of them is on the call today, has been looking at. So that's just a very quick overview of the terminology to get us into the context of what we're talking about in the webinar. If we go on to the next slide, please, what we'll see is just a brief overview, that commitment from government to be learning lessons, to do it strategically, skillfully, and as part of a commitment to prepare as best we can for the future. The aim of it really is to inform, encourage, and equip. As you can see, the audience is very broad and is later later I'll mention that actually in response to that, there is a flexible framework in place, acknowledging that learning will look slightly different in different contexts, and rightly so. The objectives really were around management of lessons, particularly in our resilience context, around supporting evidence-based identification, the prioritisation and practical implementation of learning thereafter, and of course the retention of learning in terms of consolidating and embedding. And you will just see our first poll pop up there, and we'd just be interested to know whether you were aware of the guidance, if you've come across it, taken a look, or even put it into practice. If we hop on to the next slide, that would be super. And what we see here is actually the lessons management framework. So it's broken down into 3 parts. We've got an executive summary there in about 10 or so pages that you can take a look at, the full guidance document, and then also a document of annexes and supporting materials. The framework is the sort of the linchpin of the conceptual model. And really, it's about anchoring lessons management back into that resilience framework in terms of it being about prevention rather than cure where possible. Of course, in the spirit of learning and whole society resilience, we hope to prevent the repetition of challenges seen in exercises or experienced during an emergency response and thereafter. We also want to make sure we're doing so in a whole society approach, and that it's based fundamentally on that shared understanding of risk, and that actually some of this learning that we're doing, rather than in a lot of cases for a lot of different reasons being the challenge that it is done when there is time, that actually we start to anchor it back into that risk assessment process to look at what the consequences of not addressing a challenge could be in the future and in terms of the risk it would pose. The whole guidance has been informed by leading practices and shaped by stakeholder engagement. We do liaise with international counterparts, and I'm really pleased that we have one of them from the United States on the call today, but equally, of course, with our UK resilience community. And actually, much of this is a reflection of the great practice that is already going on. We know there's challenges. We know that there's more to be done and further to go. But nonetheless, it is a step forward and hopefully a support to the community. And just to very briefly talk about the content and what you'll find when you go into the guidance, pulled out a little snippet here from the identification process as one of these 4 key process pillars: identification, prioritization, implementation, and embedding, that of course sits in a much wider continual improvement cycle. We have included some steps for each process, if that's to be helpful in your context in terms of guiding that process step by step, and there's some more detail there in the guidance. And then also we do have in the annexes some sort of aid memoirs that can help break down those steps further. So hopefully it will be a really practical guidance, but as you'll have seen on the earlier slide and also on the gov.uk landing page for this and the exercise guidance, there is an email for UKRA, UK Resilience Academy. Please do provide your thoughts and your feedback to help us to continue to evolve the guidance to make it increasingly helpful and relevant. So that's a deliberate mechanism there to enable that. And overall, I think the message of the guidance is that we're looking to continually move to a place where there is increased rigour, but without demanding rigidity, and knowing that that contextualised learning is absolutely essential, and that actually it's not expecting uniformity, but actually unity in the shared goal of all 4 processes. I think that just about brings the canter through what the guidance contains and is about to an end. And straight off the back of that, in terms of Digest 5 being titled Learning to Manage Lessons, it seemed only right to see what some of the most recent public inquiry reports had said about lessons. And of course, this published pre-response. And so actually, instead of directly looking at the, apologies, just getting a little window there. Instead of actually looking at the recommendations at that point, we've dived into the content of the findings in this case to see where there had been mention of lessons, managing lessons, prioritizing learning, etc. And so we did go back to Manchester Arena inquiry phase 2 emergency response 1 and 2, and then the recent module 1 from UK COVID-19 inquiry, and also Grenfell Tower inquiry phase 2 and volume 7 to see what we could see. And of course, deferring to the scope and prerogative of the inquiries to do what is within their terms of reference, really we were looking here for what can we take away to support our learning, and so what does that mean for us in context. And so we found 62 references to challenges relating to the management of lessons. And as you can see here, this is how they spread out. It was in some ways not a surprise that the most common theme was around challenges of implementation and putting things into action. And actually, it wasn't just a case, however, of not acting on learning. There were also cases of interrupted learning or learning which had been started, not completed, or shifting priorities, and various different elements that we'll come on to in a minute. But actually, what was really interesting as a very close second was identification. And reflecting on that, it's a really interesting area, because actually if we've got that many challenges in identification, how can we continually improve in that area to ensure that those implementation efforts are evidence-based and well placed, and then can go on to be embedded for greater improvements. So if we go on to the next slide, please. These are just a little summary of some of the things that we found under each heading. I've already spoken a little bit to the challenges in lesson implementation and identification, which actually in some cases was unidentified lessons, misidentified, in that unidentified being that they weren't captured at all, perhaps, misidentified being in that actually the way the lesson was articulated perhaps didn't really get to the root of the problem, or that they were actually identified well but left undistributed in some cases. In terms of systems, strategy and storage, this was another very interesting point, because actually the end-to-end process from experience right the way through to embedding, there's a lot within that. And I think it was clear that there was no single system that quite did everything, but that there was differences in what was being proposed to have from a system, whether that be capture, repository and storage, whether that be sort of in supporting the push for implementation and the action tracking. So that was very interesting to see some of that coming through. In terms of embedding and learning culture, there really were very few references, and I'll just briefly speak to both points. In terms of embedding, it certainly sometimes got wrapped into implementation as a singular process, but in other times was separated out in the writing and in the reporting. It was interesting to see with embedding, though, that there were so many less references. And that's interesting because in the one where it was referenced the most, of course, being the Manchester Arena inquiry, it referenced Jessup, and of course the embedding of Jessup with the principles being sound. And yet, on reflection, that is coming 10 years after Jessup was initially launched and implemented. And so perhaps with some of the other lessons, it might be that actually that time period simply hasn't extended enough, and that we're not learning enough about embedding because we're not there yet with in other areas. So perhaps there is some lag there. And learning culture, you can see some of the challenges here, which will probably be familiar ones to many. Not many references, but of course, across all 5 of these areas, it could be argued that whatever the process problem, that the culture underpinning it nonetheless played a role. And so that's a very quick summary. I do encourage you to download the latest digest if you want to look into those themes in more detail. And we have created in there tables under each heading and a full list of lessons at the back in the resource section for you to take away. Those are transferable lessons, which means that they come from the inquiries analysed themselves, but actually have transferable application in a range of resilience settings. So do go in, take a look, and see if there's an opportunity for you to make some of these learnings active in your context. Thank you very much. That brings me to the end of the analysis, and I am so pleased to introduce our first guest speaker, Mark Hines. He's the Policy and Engagement Manager at the Independent Office for Police Conduct, and he has brought to us today some of his thoughts around their processes in terms of how they make effective recommendations in response to learning. Mark, welcome. Great to have you, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Yeah, really grateful for the opportunity to come along today and talk to you about what the IOPC does to create organisational learning recommendations during the course of our work and to drive change in policing practice across England and Wales. So sadly, my colleague Megan Oliver, our Learning and Improvement Lead who created the article for the digest, is not able to join us today, so I'm stepping in to talk about that article and our work on Megan's behalf, but full credit to Megan for creating that. If you're able to move to the next slide for me, please. Thank you very much. If you want, you can load all the content for this slide, and hopefully I put transition in for this one. Oops, there we go. So for those of you that are not familiar with who we are and what we do, so I'm a Policy and Engagement Manager, and I work at the Independent Office for Police Conduct. So we're the body that oversees the police complaint system in England and Wales. We have our own team of independent investigators who investigate some of the most serious cases involving the police. We also conduct reviews into matters that have been handled locally by the police. And importantly, when it comes to thinking about learning and driving change in policing practice, we also make recommendations to police and to police forces and to agencies working in policing across England and Wales. Learning is something that is really important to us, and I could talk about this subject for hours and go into lots and lots of detail about everything that we do in the learning space, but I'm going to try really hard to contain myself to the 10 minutes and to meet the brief that I've been given. But as you can see from the middle part of the slide, learning is really baked in there front and centre into our mission as an organisation. It is one of the main drivers for everything that we do. We're all about learning, we're all about prevention, we're all about improving people's experiences of policing. So one of the ways that we can make an impact through our work is through making organisational learning recommendations during the course of our investigations and reviews, but there are also lots of other things that we can do. I'm just going to introduce you to these very briefly. I'm not going to talk about these at length, but just to signpost some of the ways that we can make a difference. So we do lots of dip sampling work to examine and really explore how forces are handling complaints and what they're learning from complaints. We work collaboratively with partners working across policing to handle super complaints. We are regularly using evidence coming from our wider work, so from the cases that we investigate, the reviews that we handle, the contact that we have with non-policing stakeholders, to draw out evidence about what's happening in policing and really put that evidence forward into consultations that are happening around things like the development of authorised professional practice, so the standards that exist in policing to help influence and shape policing behaviour. We're feeding into consultations on legislation. We're regularly sharing information to try and influence how policing is working day to day. In the team that I work in, which is the policy and engagement team, we have dedicated policy and engagement officers who are responsible for individual specialism areas. They go out and they maintain relationships with policing leads who are working in those areas. They pick up intelligence coming from their work. They share insight into what we're doing and what we're finding from our work. So we're very much about collaboration and encouraging that kind of shared learning. And one of the other things that we do, there are lots of people active in the policing space. So we're regularly sharing information with the Inspectorate for Policing, HMIC FRS, and trying to influence and shape what their inspection framework looks like. We're regularly sharing information with them in advance of inspections so that they can explore how forces are responding locally to some of the issues that we are seeing day to day. So that's just a quick skip through some of the ways that we try and make an impact through our work. If I can move to the next slide, please. But what I'm going to talk about primarily is the main focus of our article in the digest, which is our approach to recommendation development. If you can load the content for the slide, please. Thank you very much. So when we think about why we create organisational learning recommendations, for us, it's all about prevention of a recurrence of a similar incident. We try to learn from the things that have happened and stop those things happening again. Sometimes we make recommendations to try and make policing fairer, more efficient and more effective. We make lots of recommendations about improving things like use of stop and search powers through to conducting EIP searches in custody. We also use powers to share learning and good practice, so we're actively encouraging police forces to collaborate. We're actively sharing examples of things that are working well with HMIC FRS, the College of Policing, the NPCC, so that others can learn from that experience as well. And when we create our recommendations, we're actively engaging with policing stakeholders. So we're talking to the people involved in those cases. We're talking to our policymakers and managers. We're talking to our officers who are in the heart of those cases. We're also sometimes talking to community groups and community stakeholders who are directly affected and trying to learn from their experience. So we're helping to develop recommendations that are really trying to get to the heart of fixing the issues that have been identified. Okay, just to talk very briefly about our focus in terms of those recommendations. So the main types of recommendations we make that are focusing on changes to policy, guidance and training. That can be local policy guidance or training, or it can be products that exist nationally that might be owned, for example, by stakeholders like the Home Office, the College of Policing or the NPCC. We have the power to influence what those things look like at both local and national level. And we regularly make a variety of recommendations during the course of our work. So I'm conscious I'm skipping through really quickly, but please do let me know if I'm going too fast or if I'm about to run out of time. I'll just talk very briefly about our process then. So for us, when we think about creating recommendations, our process always starts with the thing that is right in front of you. Our investigators and our casework managers try and identify gaps, problems or opportunities to improve practice in the investigations or the cases that they are handling. Once they've identified those gaps, we then encourage them to look in our systems and understand their evidence base. So we're trying to understand what we've already said. We are always really acutely aware of feedback from people that sometimes they see the same recommendations coming out of lots of different agencies and nothing changes. Before we make a recommendation, we try really hard to understand what we've already said to reduce that repetition. We want to understand why action isn't being taken to implement our recommendations. And importantly, we want to try and understand a bit more if there are other potential solutions that might be more effective. So we're building our evidence base. We're then going through a process of consulting a range of specialist stakeholders internally to help shape and inform those recommendations before we move on to create recommendation wording. And when we think about what good recommendation wording looks like for us, it's always about having a really clear and specific recommendation. And then it's about having a supporting context paragraph. So for us, it's really important that our reader, whether it is the force directly involved who's trying to implement that recommendation, or a member of the public, can understand why we are making that recommendation. So we explain what happens in the case, we give a bit of information about the gap or the problem or the opportunity that we've identified in policy guidance or training. And then we talk about the difference that change might make to practice. Why we're hoping that this recommendation will address the issue that we've identified. The next step in our process then is to go out and seek feedback from the intended recipient of those recommendations. We never issue a recommendation without talking first to the recipient to understand whether they can implement that recommendation. We try to understand as well what action they're already taking to respond to that issue, because sometimes they are already taking action, and we like to reflect that in the work that we do. We also like to explore whether this is the right solution to the problem. We recognise that we don't always know what good looks like when it comes to fixing issues that have been identified. So we want to involve people and invite them to tell us what else would work better, if anything. I'm skipping through this quite fast, I know, but a lot to cover. When we reach the point of being ready to issue our recommendations, we have a number of powers that are available to us that we can use depending on the nature and type of recommendations that we're making. One of those powers, coming from the Police Reform Act, gives us the opportunity to get responses back from recipients. So there is a requirement for the recipient to tell us whether or not they accept or reject the recommendation. If they accept it, they need to tell us what action they plan to take. And if they don't accept it, then they need to tell us why they plan to take no action. When we use that power, both the recommendation and the recipient's response enter the public domain. They're published on our website, they're published on the recipient's website as well. And that's a really important way for us to drive improvement in public confidence by making really transparent the learning that's coming from our work. If you can move on to the next slide, please. This is my final slide. Thank you very much. That's great, thank you. Just to signpost a couple of products that may be of interest to you. So as the IOPC, we produce a flagship learning lessons magazine. This is thematically focused, so we're rotating between a variety of different themes. We're working collaboratively with partners across policing, from stakeholders including the College of Policing, the NPCC and the Home Office, to push out learning and content coming from our cases. The magazine includes a range of anonymised case studies, each of which includes a series of reflective questions for policymakers and managers and trainers and frontline officers and staff. We're inviting people to reflect on the learning coming from those cases and essentially think about what action they can take to plug gaps in their own knowledge, what action they can take to change their policy guidance and training to try and prevent a recurrence of similar incidents locally. We're really grateful for the support of a development panel, so a team of volunteers from across policing, the community and voluntary sector and academia who support us in developing that content. And just to say, shameless plug, if you are interested in joining our development panel to help shape and inform the development of the magazine, or you're interested in joining our mailing list, please do reach out and email us at learning@policeconduct.gov.uk. It's free to access. It's also published on our website. If you're interested in finding out a bit more about our work, there is lots of other stuff that we produce and publish online. So you will see lots of press releases where we talk about our work. We share learning and investigation reports. We publish recommendations. We also publish investigation summaries. For those of you that are more interested in complaint handling, we also have a sister publication called Focus, which gives lots of practical guidance and case studies to help people learn from our experience and improve complaint handling locally. Annually, we're producing an impact report that provides a flavour of some of the work that we do and some of the ways that we make a difference to policing. If you're really interested and excited by any of the things that I've talked about today, we do have a number of vacancies available on our recruitment portal, which you can find online, and we'll shortly be commencing recruitment for a number of policy and engagement officer roles. We also have a number of exciting posts in our oversight team and in transformation currently available as well. I mentioned transformation there. We are currently embarking on a transformation program to help us deliver more for our service users. And as part of that work, we would be really interested in talking to those of you that are working in organisations who are involved in undertaking investigations or reviews, making recommendations, and following up on the impact of your work to try and understand impact. We'd really love to have a conversation with you. If you'd like to share your experience and of the things that are working well for you. Equally, if anybody would like to find out more about what we do at the IOPC and our approach to learning, really happy to continue the conversation offline. I'm not sure if I'm close to the 10 minutes, but I'll draw to a close there. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was excellent and very good timekeeping indeed. I must commend you, but thank you for that really informative presentation. Please do put any questions that you have for Mark in the chat and our colleagues will scoop those up for later. Particularly interesting there really just to hear about the importance of the wording and some of the process around making those recommendations. That was really fantastic. Thank you. I'm now pleased to welcome our second guest speaker, Mike Icardi. Mike, thank you so much for joining us all the way from the United States. It's very early where you are, so we appreciate you logging on as we're in a comfortable afternoon slot here in the UK. And we're really looking forward to your presentation, talking about what you've learned from managing lessons, particularly in terms of implementation and action tracking. So welcome and thank you in advance to your presentation.
Thanks, Lana, for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you all this morning. Thankfully, the coffee is hot and very caffeinated, so very excited to talk about this. This is something that has been part of my career for many, many years. When I started with the state of Florida back in 2007, one of my roles was to write an analysis of our after-action reports. And I found you could basically copy and paste and change the jurisdictions and the dates, and they all said the same thing. We don't know how to talk to each other, and we don't know what our incident management system was. And so as we talked and thought about strategy of how do we implement these learnings and not just have the same things over and over again, that was something in my first emergency management career position that was big, and it stayed with me throughout my time. So I do lead FEMA's, the Federal Emergency Management Agency's continuous improvement program that is really focused on learning from disasters. Obviously, there's plenty of steady state preparedness-based actions that can be learned from. But in our focus, we look at when there is a major declared disaster that FEMA deploys staff and resources to based on the president's approval. What are we doing that is working and delivering our programs to help people before, during, and after disasters, and what is not working? How can we take that information back for action? We really have a vision for building a culture of learning. For many of you, if you're involved in the after-action review process in whatever shape it might be, you know, it's very easy to draft reports, capture information, and then have it go sit on a shelf. I thought it was really relevant what Mark was talking about when we talk about what recommendations could be implemented. We can find any number of things that have problems, and we can prescribe any number of things that could be solutions, but they may or may not actually be actionable. And that's one of the things that I want to hit on today. My slides are not nearly as fancy and well put together as Mark's and others, but I'm excited to kind of talk to what we've learned in my last 6.5 years here at FEMA about how to get that learning implemented as much as is possible. And so I'm going to talk on the next 2 slides about the concept of influence and change management, things that I'm sure are not new to many or all of you, but just some of the things that we have learned as we've gone through this process. So when we talk about influencing improvement, what I want to hit on here is few things. For those of you that have ever done assessments, you know that you can find any and all problems. I think just last year we heard multiple complaints about how the chairs in our National Response Coordination Center we're not comfortable. That is not ideal from a working environment, but it's not something that senior leadership and those in places of making decisions are worried about when there's significant policy and programmatic delivery. And so we really think through as we write our findings and observations, what are those things that have the greatest mission effect? Can we articulate what the effect is to a leader? Can we articulate it in the number of days delayed, in the number of people displaced, and the amount of dollars that have been lost, cost, delayed, etc.? And so really, really important to think about how is it affecting the mission and why should they care about it? We look to seek incremental progress and learning. This is a really hard one, I think, for folks at the headquarters level, and I'm sure you see your different levels of organization that the ability to implement change and fix things varies significantly. So our field operations, led by our federal coordinating officers, they have a lot of authority that's vested in them over their operation. They can make decisions, commit funds, and do things that may not be possible at a headquarters national agency level. And so we want to look about how we bring about that change. One thing that we've recently done just almost a year ago in March of 2024 is institute significant reforms to our individual assistance programs and how we support those individuals and households that have been affected by a disaster. And that process of reform and listening to leadership from that division was 6 years in the making. And that included after action reports that our program and others contributed information over that time, showing better understanding of what the root cause was and how they go about fixing it. And now we're working with them to assess how effective are these reforms in meeting the ends that they are intending, and what can that look like. And so looking at those baby steps, it's very hard to say how are we going to see this change 4, 5, 6 years in the future. But on those big national things, that's a mindset that has to be there. We also have to, and again, emphasizing what Mark said, understand that we're not going to get action on everything. And it has to be okay with that. We have to make those trade-offs and the decisions of where is improvement leading to the greatest change, and where is it just the reality that there are limited priorities, resources, time that everybody has, and figuring out where that influence to those that are the most impactful, effective in bringing about the help to jurisdictions, organizations, individuals, systems, processes are going to be there. And the last piece I'll say on this slide is we really are trying to emphasize how the action taken may meet multiple requirements. As I'm sure each of you all are, we have a U.S. Government Accountability Office. We have an Office of Inspector General. There's constant reports, assessments, recommendations being made, not just from our program internally, but from external partners. And so when we think about those actions that we want them to take, our ability to say, hey, when you complete this, you may be fulfilling the requirements or the recommendations from 1, 2, 3, 4 as well, is a significant opportunity to communicate and hopefully get that buy-in. That it's something that they should take action on because it's meeting other requirements as well. Let's go to the next slide in the last few minutes. Managing change is a huge part of this. There are entire programs of study around change management and experts in that area. I am not one. I have endeavored to learn on the job, as I'm sure many of you all have as well, and definitely want to build my knowledge in this area. But a couple of things that we've learned as we went through this process. So first and foremost, things don't happen by happenstance. If we are not actively leaning into working with programs, calling attention to issues and problems, there are so many things going on. There are so many things calling attention to time, resources, attention, that change is not going to happen, not because of anybody's ignorance or lack of desire to try, but just because there's so many competing priorities. And so we continue to think about how we get in front of leadership, in front of program areas, and bring about that change that we want to have happen. Secondly, we really want to focus on the stakeholders. What is their input? How do we engage with them? How do we understand where they were and where they want to be and get them bought into that process? I think oftentimes there can be an oversight of understanding the different users and steps in the process when we look at learning. And it's really important to understand who is in each of those steps, how do we engage with them, and what can we take away from them that informs our processes and being effective in that. And the last thing I'll talk to you here is looking at solutions that are familiar to users. I saw in the chat mention of tracking lessons from Excel spreadsheets. That is a commonplace across many of our state and local jurisdictions in the United States. Our program over the last 2.5, almost 3 years, has been developing an internal enterprise solution based in Microsoft Power Platform and Power Apps because it was part of our existing licensing with Microsoft. It also created a look and feel of something that people were familiar with using Microsoft Word, SharePoint, things like that. You may have your own equivalent there, but we've been building that system to manage that information, to make it accessible through the Power BI report server, and really thinking about what is a software solution that enables that information to be managed, to be tracked, to be accessible to those who we want to use it, and in a way that they're going to use it day in, day out. There's a lot of software solutions out there. A lot of providers will try to sell a lot of things. I've told folks over and over again, if it's not part of your day in, day out activity, things that you are regularly doing, it's probably not going to be used effectively. And so we're really trying to see, as we look to implement that change and track that action, to build systems that support that effectively as we go. So I think I'm at my 10 minutes. I look forward to any questions and answers. Feel free, I think my email is on the next slide, to reach out if you have any questions or would like to speak further on this. But really appreciate the time, Leanna, and look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was really informative, and it's been just great to be connecting on all things lessons management and see what you're doing there with your continuous improvement framework and the way that you've been developing that system as well. So thank you very much. And as Mike said, please do pop any questions in the chat for later. Thank you very much. I'm just going to move on now to our third guest speaker, and I'd like to introduce Sergeant Rob Simpson, who has been leading on exercise Winter Storm, and I won't steal his thunder in telling you more about what that is, but I will just make a note to one of the comments in the chat around validation, and this really is something that Rob will touch on for sure. So Rob, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Excellent to have you, and yeah, looking forward to hearing from you. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to you all about on a subject that I'm incredibly passionate about, and probably could speak for much longer than 10 minutes like most of the other speakers, but I will try and rein it in. So I'm Rob Simpson. I'm the Rural Crime Team Sergeant for Cheshire Police, but I have this wonderful other title, or this sort of onerous kind of title of being the Extreme Weather Sergeant, which originally stuck to mainly snow, and then we've developed it to look at flooding and also heat and how that's affecting our constabulary ability to do business as normal. Next slide, please. So I'm no weather expert, but what we're experiencing anecdotally and what the experts are telling us, we are seeing these weather pattern changes in the UK. We're seeing periods where we may get 72 hours of extremely cold weather, and what we've seen recently, following the snow, was then periods of flooding as well. And that kind of knock-on effect is genuinely really having this challenge for us to be able to continue doing business as usual. And just to bring in what happened in the last one, we had snow on the east of the county, which we're quite used to, but 1,000 feet lower on the west side of the Cheshire Plains, the snow hit there, and we saw main arterial routes coming to a standstill, which meant all the emergency services were really struggling, like I said, to use that phrase, to keep going and keep doing business as usual. Okay, so with that happening, we thought we really need to start looking at this and trying to develop how we were going to change how we work, how we interpret the weather and so on. The other challenge we really had, though, was the social media. And I'm sure many of you are on social media, and many of you look at these wonderful pictures on Instagram, Facebook, other social media is available, and you'll see people putting themselves in really silly situations. We had it recently with a canal collapse where people were taking themselves to the edge of the canal to get that photo, to get those likes, to draw people to their pages. And this is really putting people at risk. And we're seeing it in the snow. We had a report that 5 vehicles were stuck on the high ground in the county. And when we got up there was around 49 vehicles that had got themselves, or the owners had got themselves into positions up there of real challenge. Now, the photo you can see on the screen, it's the same one that's behind me. That was from a few years ago, and that was a bit of a turning point for me in terms of we needed to do more. And that is a young family with a 6-month-old baby. They've gone out in their Defender, wanted to try it out in the snow, and got themselves wedged. 8 hours it took us to rescue them. 4 hours to find them because they didn't know where they were, and then 4 hours to get to them with rescue teams and get them back to safety. So that was that turning point. So I wanted to challenge that. Let's do a tabletop exercise, people said. We have in Cheshire 37 pages, it's not really showing up, telling me how to operate in the snow. That's kind of a beast that's been developed over a period of time, and it goes into what we do in the run up to bad weather and so on. But our own organisations are sometimes our worst enemy, in the sense that, as you'll see on the screen, if we have a plan for that, we'll do A, B, C and D. And recently I attended an exercise helping out another county, and I had representatives from Fire Brigade there saying, but if this was real, we would have brought. And I was saying to them, well, hang on a minute, let's treat it like it's real then. And if you are going to treat it as real, have you got enough drivers to bring all that kit here? Have you got enough people to operate the kit, to know how to do it? And it does concern me that we keep coming up with these excuses for why we don't do things properly. Next slide, please. So I thought, well, let's stress test what everyone's telling me we would do. They're telling me that they'd, on this tabletop exercise, they'd abseil off helicopters, they'd have drones up and all sorts. And having been in those experiences, I knew it just wasn't the case. So I went and booked the biggest indoor ski centre in the UK, the Chill Factory in Manchester. I should have got permission. I didn't. I booked it before I got the permission. And we decided to put an exercise. Now, we've done that first year. We did it again last year. I'll talk about the last year's one because that's the most immersive one we've done yet. But we wanted to really see how people worked. We wanted to make it immersive and complex. People learn differently. It's all very well saying we have all these plans, people can read it, they might learn that way, but until you put people in it, you won't know. Have a look at that photograph. There's a fire officer there. It sounds like I've got it in for the fire brigade. I haven't, who's taken his jacket off to look after a casualty, thus putting him at risk of becoming a casualty as well. When we do these exercises, winter storm, which we've called it, and you can look it up, you can see all the photographs we've taken from it, and you can see it on our social media as well. If it's going really well, this exercise, after you've made everyone walk to the top of the snow slope and then all the way back down again, carrying all their equipment, break it, ruin it for them. So for instance, if they were turning up with certain pieces of the kit, I'd just say that's no longer working, and it give them that problem to try and get round it. And they have to evacuate casualties the same way they walked in. So this year's scenario saw a vehicle crashed at the bottom of the slope, having ignored a road closure sign, which tends to be commonplace, and effectively they'd come around the corner and they'd hit a downed electricity pole. We had electricity northwest there, we had electrical cables over the vehicle, we had another vehicle that's in the background as well that turned up with a lot of people that had also ignored the road closure sign, but their job was just to be a pain or a thorn in the side of the emergency services as they dealt with it. Now, I'm one that can very much tell you what we need for being out and about, but that doesn't necessarily translate for when I want to talk to people that in higher commanders and all that sort of stuff. So we joined up with Liverpool John Moores University, academia, so they could put it into a way that sold it better. We had guest speakers as well who were brilliant in their subject matter experts, and that way it meant that we could continue to engage people in this learning. So it attracted people from right across the way, looking at pre-hospital care all the way through to looking after yourself, your own resilience. And then making the opportunities as well. So we had students from the universities leading some of these teams. They'd never worked with them before, but they were almost commanding fire officers, really experienced fire commanders, paramedics, mountain rescue, police officers as well. And they were helping with mini scenarios, treating people, looking at hypothermia and so the complexities about working in these environments. Next slide, please. So we keep doing these exercises, and we've talked about lessons learned, or not using that phrase, but lessons that we are learning. And this is a complete journey that we're still on. We haven't got it right yet, but we're already making progress in these various different areas. So with regards to uniform and equipment, I'm sat here in traditional police equipment here, isn't very good at standing out in the snow. So you'll see on some of these images how we've moved to a very similar look to our colleagues in the volunteer services. And the reason why is when we've done these feedback questionnaires or these preemptive questionnaires using the university, it's becoming very apparent that our volunteer services are better equipped than our mainstream emergency services. The fire brigade's uniform designed to get rid of heat, ambulance had big torches, no head torches when they were turning out, so they couldn't carry as much equipment. And it's just things like that. So we're trying to get these equipment things changed. We're wearing helmets now. We're more visible. We've got micro spikes on us. We've got inflatable rescue shelters. We carry defibs. We carry other medical equipment as well. But what we are finding is, as equipment's moving forward, it's getting more tech related. My pocket notebook is a mobile phone. It has the Jessup app on it, which isn't great in those conditions because I've either got big bulky gloves on or the screen is beginning to cool down and I can't use it. The resilience mindset. That again is about the reason why we've got that kit is to look after ourselves as well as other people that might be stuck up there in bad conditions. And it's about saying we are potentially going to be up here for a long time. And we're trying to use social media, which we referred to in the first slide, to educate people and say, please don't come up into this because you might be here for 8 hours if you have an incident. Are you equipped? Have you got enough food? Are you warm? And so on. Share the knowledge. So one of the big things, we're here today, or I'm here today, talking to you about the work we're all doing, because we've got to get this out there. There's no point reinventing the wheel. I'm really pleased that there was another similar exercise held down south, which I think someone's commented on as well. And I attended that as well to see what work was going there. So it's about going on online, print, telling people we are doing these exercises, that we are prepping, we're trying to get better. The UK mindset changing and so on. And then as we look towards the future, this year we have a flooding exercise which is underway, being created at the stands at the moment, and we're also looking at heat. So as we're recognising there are these areas of issue for our constabulary, and this is reflected right across the country, we're trying to develop things that will really stress test our resolve with them. And we've had contact, or I've certainly fielded phone calls from the northern tip of Scotland all the way down to Jersey and Guernsey when they've been asking me questions about weather, which is a fascinating insight into areas which you'd think would suffer very differently, all coming together to try and work on this as one big project. But is there anything I can take away from this, or you can take away from this? If you're organising exercises, please make them as immersive as possible. People get involved in it, they get a lot more out of it. Well, certainly that's my take on it. And I think that brings me to my 10 minutes. It's a whistle-stop tour. There's lots more I can tell you about it.
Thank you, Rob. That's fantastic. Really interesting presentation and super practical as well. I'm sure there'll be some questions coming your way, no doubt, and great to hear as well about how those lessons, identified in the first year were able to go on to see what changed by the second year. So really great practice there. Thank you so much. And with no further ado, I'm really thrilled to announce our final guest speaker, Dr. Nikki Power, from University of Liverpool. Nikki, it's great to have you. Thank you so much for joining us. And we're really excited to hear from some of your latest research, what some of the lessons from the emergency services are in terms of extreme team interoperability. So I shall hand over to you. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Leanna. So hi, everyone. Thanks so much to the Emergency Planning College for pulling this together and for inviting me today. So I'm Dr. Nikki Power. I'm a senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Liverpool, and my research looks at decision-making and teamwork in extreme environments. So I've predominantly worked with the emergency services in this space, but I've also worked with other extreme teams, so critical care teams in hospitals, for example. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to be talking to you today about some of my research on interoperability, and that is kind of interwoven with Jessup. So I'm going to give a very brief history of Jessup because I'm aware there's people on the webinar today who maybe won't know what Jessup is, especially international partners. So Jessup is the national team in the UK who are responsible for improving interoperability between police, fire and ambulance, predominantly at command level as well, although that is looking to expand. They were first introduced in 2012 and they were given a chunk of funding in order to try and improve joint working interoperability. They engaged in a number of training exercises, validation exercises, and it was all around these visuals that you can see on the screen here. They created what were known as the Jessup principles, so co-locate, communicate, coordinate, risk assessment and shared situational awareness. These were identified by the Jessup team as being key to improving teamwork. They also developed the joint decision model. So again, this was a shared resource that could be used by emergency responders in order to support their collective decision making and teamwork. And their fundamental goal, therefore, was to make the police, fire and ambulance service work better together. the first real test of JESIP was at the Manchester Arena attack in 2017, and what was kind of concluded in a number of the incident and inquiries that came out after it was that JESIP was argued to have failed. So there was questions, we've already spoken quite a bit today about embeddedness, and there was questions around why was JESIP not embedded into the emergency services. So 5 years after it had been launched, why were the principles of JESIP not being followed? So as I mentioned, my background is in psychology and I look at how people operate under pressure. And I was thinking about this problem and trying to think, well, can we use psychology to try and understand a bit more about how people operate under pressure? JESIP and interoperability is fundamentally about people. So that's a social problem. How can we get people to coordinate their behaviours, to align their goals, to support one another? So I submitted a grant proposal to try and look at this problem to see whether we can look at how psychology can help in this space. Next slide, please. Okay, so I was fortunate enough to get the funding, which was great. So I was initially given 12 months of funding to try and tackle this problem. So the first thing that I did was I wanted to, well, it's kind of been mentioned before about kind of reinventing the wheel and not wanting to do that. So I thought it would be good to actually look at what research is already out there to see whether this can help us understand how psychology can help. What we did is we conducted what's called a systematic literature review, and this is where you use specific search terms, inclusion-exclusion criteria, and you go to the academic library, search through all the journals that you can find on the topic, and once you've got your corpus of data, you then analyse that to try and answer the research question that you set. So for us, that was what is the psychology of interoperability? So what are the core principles or components that come out of the academic literature that people say actually this makes a good interoperable team? So what we found is that there were 5 core themes. So these were communication, flexibility, trust, identity, and goals. Some of these are quite structural. So communications, having clear communications, avoidance of acronyms, it's kind of makes sense. A lot of people will often say, well, teamwork is about communication, but we also found these more psychological components. So trust, for example, is defined in the literature as a willingness to be vulnerable. So if you think when you trust someone, you put yourself in a vulnerable position to try and make decisions or take action based on the advice that they share with you. You're not going to check what they've said. That's the whole kind of foundation of trust. So we found that in an ideal world, you would have interpersonal trust. So you kind of see someone at scene and it's how are you rather than who are you. So that would be gold standard. However, the literature shows that there's other forms of trust that can also help in these situations. So things like cognitive trust, and that is trust that's based on that I trust your role. So I understand what your role is, what your command role is. I know that you've been on certain training in order to get into that role. So I'm going to trust you to do your job. It could also be trust based at the group level. So that's where I've worked really well with a police colleague before. So therefore, I'm going to trust that you are also representative of that group. But you can see it's more about kind of that social processing and kind of looking at more from a psychological perspective. So what we did with this is we then created this new definition of interoperability. JESIP used the term interoperability is defined as working together cohesively as a matter of routine, which is like a common sense definition, but we felt that we wanted to make something that was more specific. So we defined interoperability as a shared system of technology and teamwork built upon trust, identities, goals, flexibility, and communication. As a social scientist, I'm more kind of focusing on the social teamwork element, but obviously, as we know, technology is advancing, especially with advances in AI. So increasingly, that will become more relevant. Next slide, please. Okay, so the second part of our research was we wanted to then try and question this idea of why has JESIP not been embedded. And there's been a bit of a discussion already about the difference between embedding and implementation. I suppose for me, I was trying to think about that whilst the talks were going on earlier. And I suppose for me, in order for something to be embedded, it first must be implemented. And embedding is about that habitual use of the change or whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. So what we did for this study is we decided that we wanted to go and speak to people that had been engaging with JESIP and interoperability and ask them about their thoughts and perspectives on why embedding JESIP had been so challenging. We were fortunate that the time of us collecting data was 10 years after JESIP had been launched. So we thought, well, everyone likes an anniversary. So it's nice to do a kind of decade later, a decade on, what do people think? But when we started to actually collect this data and starting to kind of think about the responses we were getting, we increasingly became aware that the challenge of interoperability was really complex because of this multi-professional framework in which it's occurring. So you've got the emergency services that are a collection of professions. They're not really a kind of their own organization in itself. You've then got police, fire and ambulance service as separate professions. And then within each of those, you've then got multiple organisations. And as you can see from the map that's on screen, they don't even geographically map onto one another. So if we're trying to achieve change and organisational change, so changing behaviours towards interoperability, we're already kind of up against it in terms of the complexity of this framework, this multi-professional framework that we're dealing with. So what we did with our interviews is we asked people about the challenges to interoperability, what worked well, and the areas that they felt needed to be improved. And what was very clear from our interviews was that participants were very much on board with the principle of change. So they wanted to work well. They wanted to work in an interoperable team with their multi-agency colleagues. And that's quite different because when change initially is implemented, often there can be suspicion, there can be distrust of change. I remember I was collecting some of my PhD data when JESIP was first launched. And I remember there was a bit of a kind of distrust around, well, what is it? What are they actually trying to do? There was a lot of austerity at the time in the UK. So there were concerns about what JESIP was trying to achieve. But what we found instead was the challenge was in terms of the implementation of change. What we then did is we tried to look at these challenges, and what we found is they could be separated across 3 levels. So at the more macro systemic level, we found that the implementation of change was really challenged by things that were almost kind of beyond the control of the emergency services. So things like finance and kind of budgets. So not having kind of the operational capacity to engage in joint training because the emergency services are so stretched. At the more meso organizational level, what we found is that change was really inhibited by things like incompatible organizational structures. So command structures not matching onto one another. So it means that you've got people ready to engage in JESIP at scene from the fire service, but police, for example, are saying, oh, hang on, I've got to wait for my superior to arrive to engage in that. At the more micro-psychological level, we found that people wanted to engage in JESIP, but if they were in a really challenging emergency incident, the stress and pressure of that emergency meant that they said that they just ended up reverting to their silo kind of intra-organizational processes. So what we developed with this was this principal implementation framework for interoperability, so the PICI framework that we've called it. And we feel that this is a useful framework that can be used to map not only the challenges to interoperability implementation, but also to kind of identify where it's working well. So people commented that actually through JESIP, they felt that they actually trusted their multi-agency colleagues much more because they were kind of starting to identify with one another as one team. Okay, next slide. Thank you. Okay, so in terms of conclusion, what we found from our research so far, we kind of just really want to highlight the fact that social psychology can play a really good, strong role in terms of improving interoperability because it's about getting people to work together. And also just to highlight that we now have had further funding to try and develop this into evidence-based training. So if you are interested, if you're from the emergency services and you're interested in taking part, we're in the process of running some focus groups, and then we're going to be testing this new training that we're going to develop. So we're really keen to get people's feedback and to take part. Okay, and that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nikki. That was fantastic. And I must applaud all our speakers in terms of their timekeeping today. Extremely efficient. Thank you very much. And please do, if you haven't already, link the research papers so that people can access those. We do have time for our Q&A panel, which is fantastic. And I'd like to thank my colleagues for working behind the scenes in grabbing and compiling some of the questions that have been coming through in the chat. Thank you to all who've contributed. I can see there's been some responses responses happening already there, but there are a few that I'm just going to bring to the panel. And while we're doing that, you might also see a couple of other polls just pop up as well. Off the back of the talk there in terms of the research piece around Jessup, it seems a pertinent link actually to come to a question from Gary Lane, which was, where is their tie-in of the lessons process described today and the JOL process, and is there benefit in combining the two? I'm happy just to say a few words, and then David, I didn't know if you wanted to perhaps come in on that from the JOL perspective as well, or Nikki, if you have comment. I would like to thank colleagues at Jessup and JOL. We worked very closely with the Resilience Directorate and with Jessup and Home Office when we were developing the lessons management guidance. And actually within there, you'll see plenty of references to some of the interoperability joint doctrine and some of the JOL guidance, which is available on the Jessup website. And what we have really endeavoured to do there in working closely is to bring forward some of their learning and some of their best practice into the national guidance, having paved the way with a lot of the work there. And certainly there is a lot of linking in terms of the way that they identify lessons that get uploaded to the system, and then that goes through a fantastic governance process as well. And so I would encourage those who are using JOL to continue doing so. The best practice is not to circumvent that, but to complement and support that, particularly in terms of identification and in terms of the criteria for putting together a high quality lesson that can really be taken forward for action with a known root cause. David, did you want to come in at all with regards to JOL and Jessup from a central perspective?
Thank you, Leanna, for the invitation. I think we'll come back with a more detailed response, because there are so many interfaces and sort of interdependencies. But I mean, the broad order is the governance is there in terms of Home Office and Cabinet Office, in terms of some of the Jessup interoperability boards. The support is there in terms of bearer systems, because as people appreciate, JOL is hosted on Resilience Direct, which is, to be honest, an incredibly useful support system in terms of knowledge management. And I know the Jessup transformation team have put a huge amount of effort in terms of some of the software updates on the platform itself. So there are linkages which we could develop a bit further, but good question, thank you.
Thanks, David. And Nikki, did you want to come in at all on that, or have anything to add?
Yeah, just to say, I've got a PhD student and she's been doing some research looking at the use of JOL. And I think one of the things that's kind of come out, or one of the things we found that's challenging with the research, is those that use it love it, and then there's also a whole group of people who don't engage with it. So identifying kind of the people that don't submit lessons, and one of the things that we found is people are a bit unclear around whether they should put it on JOL. Do they put it on their own organization's kind of lesson management sharing practice? So so kind of, I think sometimes it's useful to be clear about the guidance on how to best use it, because it's such a good resource. It's just kind of like making sure it can be maximized.
That's great. Thank you very much, both for your contributions there. I'll take us to the next question, which actually came up during the short overview for lessons management, but was a really interesting one regarding the sort of wording around lesson implementation and the importance of validation within implementation, and the consideration that a lesson might not be considered implemented without the validation or the evidence, which for me speaks a little bit to testing and exercising. So I just wondered, Rob, would you mind speaking a little bit to that in terms of how your work has helped to validate some of the implemented actions from lessons you identified perhaps in the first year through to the second?
So ultimately, there were really simple things we could learn that were quick fixes that could change the field of what we were working. For instance, when we first did this, we were watching people inadvertently going skiing down this slope while they're trying to run this exercise, and the kind of effect it was having on it. So we were constantly learning these lessons to introduce like the micro spikes and head protection. And there were simple things that meant that we could keep operating longer periods of time, warmer, all that kind of stuff. But we knew these things. We just couldn't get it. We could read it on paper, we could do all that, but without the visuals of it. And we recorded our exercise in 360 degrees as well, so we could review it, go back to it, and see how people behaved, whether or not people switch off as well, their decision making being affected by cold weather. But the validation, working with the university, was so key, because like Dr. Amanda Farrow, who I'm doing the work with as well, they're able to put it into a descriptive language, a context that is a much broader brush for people to understand. Whereas I'm very much like, I want that kit now and all that sort of stuff. And it's very difficult to get the validation without that kind of support. So I would say that it's important we work with partners, we work with all different kind of organisations to make sure we are relearning this. And once we think it's validated as well, just keep testing it, keep going. And that kind of model has allowed us to now look at other areas of business and say, right, how can we stress test or break this?
That's fantastic. Thanks, Rob. And I don't think we could talk implementation and validation without coming across to you, Mike, as well. It'd be really interesting to see from the US perspective, how does validation fit into the way that you manage your sort of implementation and continual improvement efforts there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's one that we are not as far along as we'd like to be, because of the complexity of, at an enterprise agency national level, saying, listen, if we found this policy concern. So I'll talk to the individual systems reforms that I've mentioned in that. So I think what we are doing with the program office and with our field staff is some of that validation. They asked us, hey, we implemented these reforms that do these things in terms of providing aid in a more expedited manner to those who are affected, changing some of the program requirements, the documentation requirements. Is that working? Is that accomplishing the goal that we wanted to? Did we solve the right problem, essentially? And so I think that's probably the best case that we have right now. I think what we found is it's really complicated to try at a major organizational level to say, we saw shortfalls in staff's ability to execute this program, and then look at it on the next disaster. And if it's different staff, if it's 3 months later, like was there actually change able to be fully implemented and tracked there? And then we're still working to build our data set with the program offices that are taking the action to get regular, clear updates on the action that they've taken, so that we can then evaluate whether or not it fixed that. So a lot of opportunity in our eyes to grow on that, but also a lot of complexity to being able to more definitively at that bigger picture level say, was it successfully addressed?
That's really interesting. Thanks so much for sharing that with us. I'm aware that we're moving towards time. So I do just want to bring a question. Mark, are you still with us there? I can see that you're on the call, but I can't see your face, so I wasn't quite sure. If you are there, oh, hi, Mark. We had a question which was around specifically sort of around antisocial behaviour matters.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the question was getting really to the point of how does the IOPC, or can the IOPC engage with challenges in civil matters? And is that one of the relate to any of the learning that's come your way, or any of the things that you do?
So in terms of how the complaint system works, there are certain types of cases that forces must refer to us by law. And then there are other types of case that can come to us if we are involved in doing a review of local handling of those cases. So while we might not automatically see every single complaint that relates to antisocial behaviour, there might be certain factors that might bring some of those cases to our attention. For example, if there were, elements of discrimination, for example, in response to issues, or if there were other factors that were playing that were hitting one of the referral criteria, those things may be automatically referred to us, or we may just happen to see them through handling of reviews. So in answer to the question, we wouldn't see every single case, but we might be able to see some of those matters where there are failings in the police response, or potentially where there are challenges around police inaction. So the kind of the routinely not responding to incidents in particular areas, for example. Some of those things may come to us on occasion, but not necessarily in every case.
That's really helpful. Thanks so much for sharing that with us. And just as we're coming up to time, I think pertinent just to ask while you're on the line, Mike, again, in terms of lessons coming out of potentially from the recent events in California, and in terms of wildfires, how do you think that might shape things going forwards? Would you like to give any comment, although it'd be very early days, on that experience and any shared learning from that?
Yeah, I think I will say it's a complicated answer, and I don't have a ton of depth at the moment, just because, so much of the resources fighting the fires and managing the incident are at the state and local level. And our role at the federal level is to really support those resources. Obviously, we have a major disaster declaration. The team is on the ground, supporting individuals. There's going to be a lot of complicated and complex decisions that are made. With that, I think the biggest thing is when you look at the devastation of the number of houses. I believe the count is over 10 or 11,000. It is not easy to find permanent housing for those folks. And so we do have learning from previous fires in California, up the Camp and Paradise fires. I think it's 2017. We've done some learning from the 2024 Maui wildfires of, how do you address that housing requirement? Because people need somewhere to live, and it's going to take a lot of time to deal with that. So I think the housing is going to be a big thing, and then the debris management is also a huge piece based on the contamination and some of the hazardous waste that happens there, so that people can start that rebuilding process, and it takes months, if not years. So those are things that we're looking at. We had a team member go out last week to meet with leadership and kind of begin to collect some of that early information, and so hoping to continue to learn from that process.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much for your input. And that's us up to time on Learning to Manage Lessons webinar live. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you especially to our guest speakers for your time, for your experience, your expertise and your knowledge exchange. Thank you very much to all who've attended and left comments in the chat, and we will endeavour to collate some of the questions which may not have received an answer during this slot. But for now, it's goodbye from us, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next webinar for Digest 6. Thank you very much.